is a very complicated issue for politics because on the one hand, it's a home of very intimate relationships where people should have a good deal of freedom to decide how they want to shape their own relationship. And parents certainly have the right to shape the upbringing of their children in many, many ways. On the other hand, because children are born into the family and the family determines their opportunities in a very basic way, the family has got to be conceived as the cradle of political society. Children are future citizens, and the government has a responsibility to protect the health, the education, and the welfare of children. And of course, then adult members of the family also will need protection from any kind of non-consensual violence that they might encounter there. So the family cannot be conceived of as a sphere that's immune from the government, but the government has to be very careful in the way it intervenes in order to protect intimacy and choice. The public-private distinction is a nest of confusions. The notion of privacy is not a single notion. It's about 4 different notions. One notion is informational. The private is what we keep secret, and the public is what's known to everyone. Another notion is a notion of autonomy and choice. The right of privacy in both Indian and United States constitutional law is a right to decisional autonomy in matters such as contraception and family planning and so on. So that's a very different notion from the notion of informational secrecy. I can take my contraceptives right out in public and everyone can know about it. Then a third notion is the notion of seclusion. The privacy is what is behind closed doors, and of course that's usually associated with the home as a privileged place. But that's a very different notion because autonomy is something women should have wherever they are, not only in the home. And then finally, the fourth notion that's often run together with all of these is the notion of the private as what's immune from the intervention of government. Now, see, we really need to take it apart. We need to ask what it is we want to protect in each instance. So I think, what's really at stake for women is mostly decisional autonomy. And that decisional autonomy in matters of intimate relationship and reproduction and so on ought to be protected wherever women are. But often law gets very confused about this and they think, well, if it's in the home, then that's private, but when women are out in the public, it's not so protected. But for example, sexual privacy is the same important decisional value whether a woman is in a hotel or in a home. And so the confusion that's created by using the word private is often very damaging. In United States law, the important decision that legalized same-sex relationships ran together several different notions. It used the notion of autonomy, but it also said, oh, and this took place in the home. And then they also mentioned the notion of intimacy, which is the notion of seclusion. So we don't even know now whether, let's say, the relationship of 2 same-sex partners who have sex in some public establishment like a hotel is protected by law. So what we mainly need is to take these notions apart, and then when we do, I think we see that what government must most importantly protect is the decisional autonomy of everyone, and so consent would be a key notion. Children are brought up in families, and the families transmit cultural values, which may be very hierarchical. Now then the question is, and I think it's a very difficult question, what can government do about that? Now I think it's pretty clear that whenever the cultural values include physical violence or the threat of violence, then the government must intervene to protect both women and children from violence. But suppose it's a more subtle kind of emotional coercion, where, let's say, parents threaten that they're going to withdraw their love if you don't date the person of the right religion, or if you don't get high grades in school, or if you don't behave in a docile and submissive way. Well, you know, those things can be just as bad as physical violence, really. But I think it's the wise course is for government to back off in those cases and not directly intervene, but rather through education and employment opportunities to create for women and for all children exit options from any bad family situation that they don't like. Of course, we all grow up in these hierarchical families, but if we get a good education in government schools and we have numerous employment opportunities, then we're free of that family in the end, and we can move wherever we like. I was able to change my religion, I was able to get a job, and so, you know, and in that sense I was free of my family, but not because the government snatched me out of the family, but rather because they gave me good schooling and employment opportunities. I think there's a very delicate balancing act here, because, of course, what's absolutely fatal to any development project is for, let's say, Americans or Europeans to walk in pretending to know everything and just tell people what to do. Usually, they don't even criticize themselves. And of course, the same problems that exist in India exist in America. And it's nothing more irritating than hear Americans say, oh, you women face problems of sexual violence, when every American woman also faces those same problems. So great sensitivity needs to be exercised, and local knowledge also needs to be respected. We know how many development projects fail because people don't bother to find out what local people know about their water supply or their agriculture and so on. On the other hand, I think no one supposes we should simply defer to the age-old cultural practices. Usually that just means you're not listening to all the voices, because cultures are scenes of debate and contestation. And when people say, oh, we should respect cultural values, usually that means male elite values. So a sensitive development project will produce on the ground a debate in which women's voices will be heard. I mean, of course, I've seen countless good development projects in India that do that. It's just a routine process of bringing the voices to the surface and letting women actually speak. You can't hope to have progress if only the women are demanding it, because men hold the reins of power, and so along the way, women, to get change, are going to have to persuade at least some men. So an education for development must include men, but of course not to the exclusion of women. I don't know why one would say that. I think the impetus has to begin with women, but they have to make clear to men why this is in everyone's interest. Often I find in the development projects I've seen in India, it's easier to do that if you foreground economic development and economic empowerment. If a project comes in and says, we're here to change your gender roles and to stop you from having power, you know, the men won't like that and they won't cooperate. But if they say, well, you know, we're here to help the village be more prosperous by involving the energy of women for economic development and change, that's much more palatable. So I think you do need to try to get men on your side, but of course it has to begin with women. I think things are moving along really pretty well. I mean, who would have thought in 1900 that women would have come as far as they had? In 1900, women could not vote anywhere, you know, and the tremendous energy that the whole international women's development process has unleashed ever since the first International Women's Meeting has been remarkable and terrific. And so you just look at the data and you see that women have come up in every measure. So life expectancy, health indicators, education, political participation. Now, it's still not good enough, and women lag behind in many countries, and not always the ones that you would, not only the poorest countries. In my country, women are lagging behind in political participation, particularly, even though at the level of basic health and nutrition, women do quite well. So each country needs to figure out where are the problems located. Is it more in the area of health, more in the area of education, and more in the area of political participation? But I'm really encouraged. I think any feminist has to be an optimist, because we see what wonderful changes we've observed. And, in education especially, I mean, when I was in university, only very few universities were even open to women. And they started opening up and so on. But by now, they really have to have affirmative action for men in most universities in the world, because women are scoring higher on the tests. And it's not only in Europe and North America, but actually I know in the University of Amman in Jordan, 75% of the students are women, because the entrance is by examination and women are doing better. So I think it's fantastic, and we just need to not relax our determination, but keep up the struggle.